All right, good morning, everybody. It is time for the next set of notes on civil rights. So this will be divided into two parts as well because it's a little too long for 15 minutes. So first part will be a little shorter, and then we'll get to the second part. All right, so we left off yesterday or last time with the idea of what civil rights were and sort of how the idea works. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about, and we mentioned the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So we're going to talk about a couple of things that are really important about it. So you need to know, in the end here, you need to know what the Civil Rights Act of 64 did, and these are the major things. Okay, first of all, it made, in addition to the idea that came from Brown, which was desegregation in public schools, now it's going to bring from the federal level the idea that racial discrimination was illegal in public accommodations, so hotels, motels, restaurants, those kinds of things. So making that illegal as well. So you get rid of things like the segregated lunch counters and the separate water fountains and all of those kinds of things that we've seen, at least from history, about that time period. Also ended discrimination in employment on the basis of those things: race, color, national origin, religion, or gender. The discrimination on those basis is illegal. Okay. And in order to deal with that, they created a federal office that is now part of the bureaucracy, if you remember from Unit 2. Excuse me. They created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, to deal with complaints. So even today, that office still exists. If you have an issue where you think there was employment discrimination, that would be the office that you would contact with your complaint, and you would go from there. It also, and this we actually talked about with the Brown case, and when we went forward from that, I think it was in the last slide from last time, that the idea of desegregation didn't really happen until they took the money away. And that came in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act. And so they withheld discrimination or withheld grants to public institutions that discriminated on the basis of race. Okay, so that's when they lost the money, when those schools, southern schools districts started to lose money, then they started to comply. Also, there was some voting rights legislation. We'll talk a little bit today about the next year when we actually have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but there was some voting rights legislation in this Act of 64. And it also authorized the Justice Department to initiate lawsuits to desegregate public schools. So that now that the U.S. government, the Justice Department, could go in and do the lawsuit themselves, they didn't have to wait for somebody like Linda Brown and the NAACP to come along. They could proactively go ahead and do it without having to go find a plaintiff and all that. They become the plaintiff. So made things a little easier, made things a little faster. Okay, sorry about that. So let's move along to the right to vote. Let's look at the concept here to start with. We're going to talk about the idea, if you remember from at least certainly back at the beginning of the Republic, suffrage over time has been limited, and it's been over time that suffrage has been expanded. And the three things we're going to talk about, at least just initially here, the idea of suffrage and the expansion of it was changed by three different amendments: the 15th, the 19th, and the 26th. We're going to talk about the 15th and the 26th today, and we have a separate part of this unit, which will actually happen next time, where we talk about things involving women, and that's when we'll talk about the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. So we'll talk about that then. But the 15th, we talked a little bit about this the other day. 1870, the last of the Civil War amendments, that's the one that said that you cannot discriminate for voting based on race. So in effect, this gave black men the right to vote in the country. And the text of it is over there on the right. And then, of course, the 26th, the one that might involve you, certainly, especially since most of you are seniors, in 1971, the minimum age was changed to 18. So that's where that got set up. So 26th Amendment, minimum age to 18, and then, of course, the text of that amendment is right there. So that's the idea to start with. Now, of course, once those things happened, there was a resistance in the South to voting rights, expanding the voting rights. It's even starting back in 1870 when black men got the right to vote. Many states required, and this goes all the way through into the 60s, the 1960s, many states required literacy tests to register to vote. And just give you an idea, this one is from, I think this one's from a Louisiana literacy test. If you look at some of those particular questions in there, they are, keep in mind that they're testing people who might not be very literate, okay, which is what I guess the test is for, and they're going to ask a bunch of questions. You can see this is just one page, questions 14 through 23. There's more, and then of course started at question 1. Plus these things were timed. So some of these things, we are all very literate here. Even some of these things we're looking at, if you look at number 20, it's spell backwards forwards. You're going to take some time to think about that. And imagine somebody who's not very literate trying to do that. Or number 21, print out the word vote upside down, but in the correct order. Or some of those, if you read 21 and or 22 and 23, if you look behind my picture, when you get the regular PowerPoint, you can see some of those. It's just crazy stuff designed to make sure that people who are not very literate, which is going to be the poor population, and the poor population is going to be primarily minority population in the South, designed specifically so they couldn't be allowed to vote. So again, rarely used for white voters, used to keep black voters from voting. Even sometimes white voters, the establishment, which is the Democratic Party in this case, back in this time frame, they didn't really care if the poor white people didn't vote either. They didn't really care about them either. But it's mostly geared towards the black population. There were other things called grandfather clauses. These ones were quite clever in their own way to try to make sure that only white people voted, because you didn't have to take a literacy test or other things, maybe pay a poll tax, if a member of your family was eligible to vote in 1860. 1860 is before the Civil War. The only people eligible to vote before the Civil War in the South were white people. So this made sure that white people didn't have to take the literacy test. If they had somebody in their family, grandfather, that's why I call it grandfather clause, who could vote in 1860. So another way to get around allowing minorities to vote. Poll tax is another one. A small tax, generally very, very small, but still too much for the poor population. Almost always too much for the black voters, and sometimes the poor whites as well, to vote. So even though it was minimal, it still was too much for the poorer population. Those were outlawed by the 24th Amendment in 1964. So that's probably, I think, might be the shortest amendment we have out there. It's very short. It just basically says poll taxes are not allowed. And then the last thing, some places in the South used what was called white primaries, or they allowed white primaries. And of course, it's the Democrats in this case because they controlled the South, and they used those to exclude blacks from primary elections. And what they did was they would have a big primary election and everybody could vote, but then they'd have a white primary, and that's the only one that counted. Those were outlawed even before we get to the Civil Rights era, outlawed during World War II in 1944. So these things happen, and that's what the addition of things like the Voting Rights Act that we're going to talk about momentarily that get to why the Voting Rights Act was passed. So let's get to it. 1965 Voting Rights Act. Abolished literacy requirements for anyone who completed 6th grade. Okay, boom, that's done. And most people by that time are going to at least finish 6th grade. Outlawed procedures which discriminated based on race or color. Okay, so things like perhaps poll taxes and stuff like that. They're going to be outlawed, although those were outlawed the year before. Sent federal help, they called them registrars, to places with histories of discrimination, mostly in the South, but some places in the North, where they would send federal people to help the black people register to vote, get them through that process, make sure they weren't taken advantage of, and then to help them go through the process and they weren't taken advantage of and not allowed to vote and things like that. So it was federal help to make sure these things were put into place, because they knew the Southern governments were going to try to resist as much as they could. So that created huge changes. So just to give you an idea, in 1965, when this was passed, there were only, in all 11 Southern states, there were only 70 black office holders. And we're talking about, mayors and city councils and stuff like that, all the way up through House and Senate. Of course, there were no House and Senate members that were black in this case, in this time frame. But you get an idea. Another decade later, so the early 80s, 2,500 black office holders. And by now, there's well over 9,000, and all the way up through, and including members of the House, members of the Senate. Ironically, very interestingly, I think the only black member of the Senate right now, is a guy named Tim Scott. He is a Republican from South Carolina. So just kind of an interesting sort of ironic twist to kind of where we're at. Okay, last slide for this one. This will be our assignment today. Letter from a Birmingham jail. It sort of fits into this civil rights time frame. So it's a foundational document, and that will be what we do today. You'll be doing much more in depth on that. But let's get the basics here. Martin Luther King wrote it. He was in Birmingham, Alabama, to support a nonviolent set of actions against segregation. As you'll read in the things, he says he's probably right. Birmingham might have been the most segregated city in the country at this time. This is 1963. He was arrested and jailed for disobeying an injunction against marching and demonstrating. So it's going to be civil disobedience, marching and demonstrating, and he gets sent to jail, and that's where he then writes this letter. He writes it in response to a previous letter, and that's part of the assignment as well, from area clergymen, I think 8 of them, asking for law and order, asking them to put off their march and wait and let another process take place. And he's answering that, and he'll answer that with a long, very moving, very eloquent statement about the reason for civil disobedience and how it works and why it works. And so you'll be reading that today. So that'll be your assignment today. And that should be it for this section. There'll be another section here to finish up, part 2B, and then you'll be able to get to your assignment.